A pregnant wife, a frozen mountain road, a husband who walks away into the blizzard and never looks back. She found his secret phone. She read the messages. And what she discovered was worse than the cold trying to kill her. He planned everything. The storm, the abandoned car, the $5 million insurance policy, but he made one fatal mistake. He assumed she would die quietly. She did not. What happens next is a story of survival, betrayal, and revenge that will leave you speechless. Stay until the end because the final twist, you will never see it coming. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. And if this story grips you, hit subscribe so you never miss another. Let us begin. The frozen tears on her cheeks had turned to ice. Meredith Calloway pressed her palm against the window of the dead SUV as the blizzard screamed outside like something alive and hungry. The temperature inside the car had dropped so fast that her breath came out in pale clouds that hung in the air before disappearing. Her other hand gripped her swollen stomach as another contraction tore through her body with merciless force. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound that came out was barely a whisper lost in the roar of the wind. The dashboard lights had gone dark. The engine refused to turn over, and her husband was gone, swallowed by the white void that had become her prison. Her water broke in a sudden rush of warmth that soaked through her clothes and spread across the seat beneath her. She looked down at the growing stain with terrified eyes, and the baby was coming. The baby was coming, and she was alone in the middle of nowhere with no heat and no help and no way to survive. She screamed into the storm. The storm did not answer. 12 hours earlier, the world had looked completely different. Meredith stood at the window of their beautiful mountain home, watching the first snowflakes drift down from a gray Montana sky. The house sat on 15 acres of pristine wilderness, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the growing wind. It was the kind of home she had dreamed about as a little girl growing up in cramped city apartments. Douglas had bought it for her as a wedding present 3 years ago, and she had fallen in love with every inch of it. She pressed her hand against her lower back where a dull ache had been building since morning. The contractions had started the night before, irregular and manageable, but they were growing stronger with each passing hour. Her due date was still 4 days away, but she knew her body well enough to understand what was happening. Douglas appeared behind her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. She leaned back into his chest and felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her spine. "I talked to the weather station," he said softly. "They are calling this the storm of the decade. Some areas might get 3 feet by morning." Meredith nodded slowly. "I felt another contraction about 20 minutes ago. They are getting closer together." Douglas tensed slightly behind her, and she felt his arms tighten around her for just a moment before relaxing again. "Then we should think about heading to the hospital soon, before the roads get too bad." She turned in his arms and looked up at his face. Douglas Calloway was handsome in the classic American way, with strong features and blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. At 36, he had built a successful real estate development company from nothing, and he wore his success with the easy confidence of a man who believed he deserved everything he had achieved. "Should I call an ambulance?" she asked. Douglas shook his head quickly. "The ambulances will be dealing with accidents all over the county tonight. By the time one gets here, we could already be at the hospital. I will drive you myself. It is safer that way." Something flickered in his eyes as he spoke. Something she could not quite identify. But another contraction chose that moment to grip her abdomen, and she closed her eyes against the wave of pressure until it passed. When she opened them again, Douglas was already moving through the room with quick, purposeful strides. He grabbed her hospital bag from the closet and carried it toward the front door. She noticed him checking his phone twice as he walked, his thumb swiping quickly across the screen before sliding it back into his pocket. Meredith followed him slowly, bracing herself against the wall as another small wave of discomfort rolled through her. She paused at the nursery door and looked inside at the room they had spent months preparing together. The walls were painted soft yellow. A white crib stood in the corner with a mobile of silver stars hanging above it. Everything was ready for their daughter. Douglas appeared beside her. "We need to go now, Mary. The storm is moving faster than they predicted." She nodded and let him guide her toward the garage. As she climbed into the passenger seat of his black SUV, she noticed that he had not packed her phone charger. She started to mention it, but Douglas was already behind the wheel, starting the engine with a focused intensity that silenced her. The SUV pulled out of the garage and into the swirling snow. Meredith watched their beautiful home disappear in the rearview mirror, shrinking smaller and smaller until the blizzard swallowed it completely. She did not know it then, but she would never see that house again. Douglas drove faster than she expected, pushing the SUV through the thickening snow with aggressive confidence. The tires hissed over patches of ice that had already begun forming on the asphalt. Meredith gripping the door handle and tried to focus on breathing through the contractions that continued to build. After 10 minutes, she looked up from her breathing exercises and frowned at the landscape outside her window. The road had narrowed considerably. Trees pressed in close on both sides like dark sentinels standing guard over some forbidden territory. She did not recognize this road at all. "Douglas," she said carefully, "where are we going? This is not the way to the hospital." He did not look at her. "Shortcut. The main highway will be jammed with people trying to get home before the storm peaks. This way is faster." His hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckle intensity. His jaw was set in a hard line that she had seen before, usually when he was closing a difficult business deal or arguing with someone who had challenged his authority. Meredith wanted to believe him. She had always wanted to believe the best about the man she had married, but as the SUV climbed deeper into the mountains, moving further and further from civilization, a cold knot of fear began forming in her chest that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She looked at her husband and tried to see the man she had fallen in love with. But all she saw was a stranger driving her into the heart of a blizzard with an expression on his face that she could not read at all. The SUV continued its ascent into the mountains as the blizzard transformed into something almost apocalyptic. Snow no longer fell from the sky in gentle flakes. It attacked from every direction at once, driven sideways by winds that shrieked through the pine trees with supernatural fury. The headlights cut through the white chaos for only a few feet before being swallowed completely. Meredith pressed her hand against the window and felt the cold seeping through the glass. Her breath fogged the surface in expanding circles that faded and reformed with each exhale. Another contraction gripped her abdomen, stronger than the ones before, and she leaned forward with a sharp gasp. "How much further?" she managed to ask through clenched teeth. Douglas did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the narrow road ahead, his face illuminated by the pale glow of the dashboard lights. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a flatness that sent ice down her spine. "Not much further now." The road opened suddenly into a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. Douglas slowed the SUV and eased it to a stop in the center of the open space. The engine idled for a moment, then went silent. The headlights died. The dashboard went dark. Meredith looked at her husband with growing confusion. "Why are we stopping, Douglas? We need to keep moving. The hospital is still miles away." Douglas sat perfectly still for several long seconds. His hands remained on the steering wheel. His breathing was slow and controlled. When he finally turned to look at her, his expression was completely empty. "The car died," he said flatly. "Engine gave out." Meredith shook her head quickly. "That does not make sense. The car was running fine. There were no warning lights. Nothing was wrong." Douglas opened his door without responding. Cold air rushed into the cabin like a living creature, carrying snow that stung her exposed skin. He stepped out into the blizzard and walked around to the front of the SUV. She watched him through the windshield as he opened the hood and leaned inside, his body quickly becoming coated with snow. Another contraction hit her with brutal force. She gripped the seat with both hands and breathed through it, counting the seconds until it passed. When she looked up again, Douglas was standing beside the driver door, his face blank. "I need to go find help," he said. "There is a ranger station a few miles back. You need to stay here and wait." Meredith stared at him in disbelief. "You cannot be serious. You cannot leave me here. I am in labor." "Douglas, the baby is coming." He did not respond to her words. Instead, though, he reached down to his left hand and slowly removed his wedding ring. The gold band caught the faint light from somewhere as he placed it deliberately on the dashboard between them. Meredith felt her heart stop. "What are you doing?" Douglas looked at her one final time. His eyes held nothing. No love, no guilt, no regret, just empty calculation. "Goodbye, Meredith." He stepped back and closed the door before she could respond. Through the frosted window, she watched his shape move away from the car, walking into the blizzard with steady, unhurried steps. No hesitation, no backward glance. Just a man disappearing into the white void like he had somewhere important to be. Meredith fumbled for the door handle with numb fingers. She pushed it open and stumbled out into the storm, immediately staggered by the force of the wind that slammed into her body. Snow filled her mouth and eyes. Cold bit through her clothing like teeth. "Douglas," she screamed. "Douglas, come back. Please, please do not do this." The wind swallowed her words before they could travel more than a few feet. She took 3 steps forward and nearly fell as her foot caught on something buried in the snow. Her hands reached out instinctively to catch herself, pressing into the frozen ground. She screamed his name again and again until her throat was raw. The blizzard answered with nothing but its endless howl. Meredith struggled back to the SUV on trembling legs. Her clothing was already soaked through. The cold had penetrated her bones. She pulled herself back into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. But the warmth that had existed inside the cabin was already gone. She turned the key in the ignition. Nothing happened. She pressed the start button repeatedly, desperately, but the dashboard remained dark. The engine stayed silent. The heater refused to respond. Another contraction ripped through her body, the strongest yet. She doubled over with a scream that echoed through the empty car. When it finally passed, she was trembling uncontrollably, and tears were streaming down her face. She understood now. The car had not broken down. Douglas had done something to disable it. He had driven her out here into the middle of nowhere and left her to die. Her husband had abandoned her in a blizzard to murder her without getting his hands dirty. The temperature inside the car dropped with terrifying speed. Meredith wrapped her arms around her stomach, trying to protect the life inside her from the death that was closing in from all sides. Her teeth chattered so violently that she could barely think. She was going to die out here. She and her baby were going to freeze to death in this godforsaken wilderness. And Douglas would be free to live whatever life he had planned without them. The thought sparked something deep inside her. Not acceptance, not surrender, something harder and sharper that cut through the fog of cold and fear. No, not like this. Not without a fight. She leaned forward and began searching the car desperately. Her numb fingers fumbled through the center console, the glove compartment, the storage pockets on the doors. She needed something, anything that might help her survive. Her hand brushed against something hard and unfamiliar wedged beneath the passenger seat. She pulled it out and stared at it with confusion. A phone. Not her phone. A second phone she had never seen before. The screen flickered to life as her thumb brushed across the surface. Dozens of unread messages filled the display. Meredith began to read, and the nightmare she thought could not get any worse became something far more horrifying than she had ever imagined. The phone's glow illuminated Meredith's face as she scrolled through months of messages with trembling fingers. The cold had become a distant thing, pushed aside by the horror unfolding on the small screen before her. Each text was another knife sliding between her ribs. The messages were between Douglas and someone named Vivian. The name sparked a dim recognition in Meredith's memory. Vivian Hartley. Douglas had mentioned her a few times as his new business partner. Young, ambitious, exactly the kind of person he liked to work with. Now Meredith understood why. The earliest messages were flirtatious in a way that made her stomach turn. Pet names, inside jokes, plans to meet at hotels when she thought Douglas was traveling for business. But as she scrolled forward through the timeline, the tone shifted into something darker. Vivian had written 3 months ago. The insurance policy came through. $5 million with Douglas as beneficiary. Everything is in place now. Douglas had responded. Perfect. We just need to wait for the right moment. Something that looks like an accident. Meredith stopped breathing. Her eyes moved across the words again and again, trying to find some other interpretation. There was none. She kept scrolling with numb fingers. Vivian, the baby complicates things. We should have done this sooner. Douglas, the baby does not change the plan. If anything, it makes the timing better. A tragic accident during labor. The storm of the decade. No one will question it. A contraction gripped her abdomen with sudden ferocity, and Meredith gasped through it while clutching the phone against her chest. When the pain finally released her, she was soaked in sweat despite the freezing temperature. She forced herself to keep reading. The messages from the past week were the worst. They detailed everything. The gambling debts Douglas had accumulated without her knowledge. $2.3 million owed to people who did not accept payment plans. The offshore accounts where he had been hiding money for months. The plan to drive her into the mountains during the blizzard and leave her to die. Vivian had texted just hours ago. Tonight is perfect. The storm will cover everything. She will not make it through this. Douglas had responded. After this, we will be free. Vancouver tomorrow, then Costa Rica, then wherever we want. The final message was from Vivian, sent approximately when Douglas had been standing beside the disabled car. Is it done? Douglas had replied with a single word and done, Jean. Meredith let the phone fall into her lap as something inside her shattered completely. Her entire marriage had been a lie. Every kiss, every promise, every moment of intimacy had been part of a long game designed to end with her death. Douglas had never loved her. He had married her for her family's money, impregnated her to secure his claim, and waited patiently for the perfect opportunity to collect on her life insurance. 3 years. She had spent 3 years building a life with a man who was planning to murder her the entire time. Another contraction hit, and this one brought her to the edge of consciousness. The pressure was building faster now. Her body was preparing to bring her daughter into the world whether she was ready or not. She looked at the phone again through a haze of tears. The battery showed 8% remaining. She needed to call for help, but when she checked for signal, there was nothing, not a single bar. The mountains and the storm had combined to create a communications dead zone. Meredith scrolled through the phone's contacts, hoping to find something useful. Most of the numbers were unlabeled, probably burner contacts that Douglas and Vivian used to coordinate their schemes. But one contact stood out with a full name attached. Noelle Chambers. Meredith's breath caught. Noelle was her best friend from college. They had grown apart over the years as Meredith's life had become consumed by Douglas. But the friendship had never completely died. Why did Douglas have Noelle's number saved? She opened the message thread and felt her blood turn to ice. Douglas had been monitoring their conversations, intercepting texts, tracking when they planned to meet, making sure Noelle never got close enough to see the truth. A new wave of rage cut through the cold and the fear and the pain. This was not just betrayal. This was systematic destruction. Douglas had isolated her from everyone who might have helped her see what was happening. Meredith looked at the wedding ring still sitting on the dashboard where Douglas had placed it. The gold band caught the faint light from the phone screen and seemed to mock her. She grabbed the ring and threw it against the window with all the strength she had left. It bounced off the glass and disappeared somewhere in the dark footwell. Another contraction came, and she screamed through it this time. Not just from pain, from fury. When it passed, she gripped the phone and spoke out loud to the empty car. I am not going to die out here. Do you hear me? Douglas, I am not going to let you win. I am going to survive this. I am going to protect our daughter. And when I get out of here, I am going to destroy everything you have built. The blizzard screamed outside like it was trying to argue with her. Meredith did not care. She was done being the victim in Douglas Calloway's story. She was going to become his worst nightmare. She began searching the car again with renewed determination. There had to be something she could use to survive until morning. A blanket, a flare, anything. Her fingers found a small emergency kit wedged beneath the back seat. Inside were a flashlight, a reflective blanket, and a handful of chemical hand warmers. Not much, but enough to buy her a few more hours. She wrapped herself in the blanket and activated the warmers, pressing them against her core. The contractions were getting closer together now. The baby was coming, whether she was ready or not. Then, through the howling wind, she heard something that stopped her heart, the distant rumble of an engine. Headlights appeared through the swirling snow, like the eyes of some ancient beast emerging from the darkness. Someone was coming. Garrett Bowen had lived in these mountains for 30 years, and he had seen storms that would make grown men weep. But this blizzard was something else entirely. This was the kind of weather that killed without mercy or warning, the kind that turned simple mistakes into frozen corpses discovered months later when the snow finally melted. He should not have been out here at all. Every sensible bone in his body had told him to stay in his cabin, to hunker down with his supplies and wait for the worst to pass. But his trapline was still set, and the thought of animals suffering through the night while caught in metal jaws was something his conscience could not accept. Garrett was 55 years old, with gray streaking through his brown hair and deep lines carved into his weathered face by decades of sun and wind. He had served 20 years as an Army medic before retiring to Montana, where he built a cabin with his own hands and learned to live off the land. His wife had died 7 years ago, and he had not been off the mountain since. His old pickup truck struggled against the wind as he navigated the narrow road down from the ridge. The headlights barely penetrated the wall of white in front of him. He was driving more by memory than sight, trusting the feel of the road beneath his tires to guide him home. Something dark appeared in the snow ahead. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree or a boulder that had rolled onto the road. But as he got closer, the shape resolved itself into something that made him slam on his brakes. A black SUV sat abandoned in a small clearing, already half buried by drifting snow. No lights, no movement, no indication that anyone was inside. Garrett pulled his truck alongside the vehicle and grabbed the heavy flashlight from his passenger seat. The wind tried to tear the door from his hands as he stepped outside, but he had spent too many years fighting worse conditions to be bothered by it. He approached the SUV cautiously, sweeping the flashlight beam across the windows. The driver's side was empty, but when the light reached the passenger side, his heart nearly stopped. A woman was slumped against the window, her face pale as death, her eyes barely open. She was clearly pregnant, clearly in distress, and clearly moments away from losing consciousness. Garrett pounded on the glass. Ma'am, can you hear me? The woman stirred slightly but could not seem to focus on him. He tried the door handle. Locked. Without hesitation, he swung the heavy flashlight against the window near the edge. The glass cracked but did not break. He hit it again harder, and this time it shattered inward. He reached through the opening, ignoring the cuts from the remaining glass, and unlocked the door from inside. When he pulled it open, the woman nearly fell out into his arms. He caught her and felt how cold she was. Hypothermia had already begun its work. Can you hear me? He asked, patting her cheek gently. What is your name? Her lips moved weakly. Meredith. Okay, Meredith. My name is Garrett. I am going to get you somewhere warm. Can you understand me? She nodded almost imperceptibly. Then her face contorted with pain as a contraction gripped her body. Garrett recognized the signs immediately. You are in labor, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she whispered. He left me, my husband. He left me here to die. Garrett's jaw tightened. He had seen plenty of evil in his years as a soldier and as a civilian, but leaving a pregnant woman to freeze to death in a blizzard was something that tested even his capacity for understanding human darkness. Well, he is not here anymore, Garrett said firmly, and I am not going to let you die. We need to get you to my cabin. It is closer than any hospital, and you need warmth right now more than anything else. He lifted her from the car, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing at all. She clutched something in her hand, a phone that she refused to release even in her weakened state. Garrett carried her through the blizzard to his truck and settled her onto the passenger seat. He cranked the heater to maximum and wrapped his own coat around her shoulders before climbing behind the wheel. The truck lurched forward through the snow as Garrett pushed it as fast as he dared. Meredith drifted in and out of consciousness beside him, occasionally crying out when contractions hit. Each time, Garrett kept one hand on the wheel and used the other to grip her shoulder, reminding her that she was not alone. 20 minutes later, they reached his cabin. It was a modest structure built from local timber, but it was solid and warm and stocked with enough supplies to survive a month of isolation. He carried Meredith inside and placed her on the bed near the wood stove. Within minutes, he had the fire roaring and blankets piled on top of her. Her color began to return slowly as warmth seeped back into her body. You saved my life, she whispered when she could finally speak clearly. Garrett shook his head. You are not out of danger yet. That baby is coming, and we are snowed in until morning at least. But I was a medic for 20 years. I have delivered babies before. You are going to be okay. Meredith looked at him with eyes that held something beyond gratitude. She held up the phone she had been clutching since the car. You need to see this, she said. My husband tried to murder me, and I have proof. Garrett took the phone and began reading the messages. His expression grew darker with each scroll of his thumb. When he finished, he looked at Meredith with a cold fury burning in his eyes. I have seen evil before, he said quietly. This is calculated evil, and we are going to make sure he pays for every bit of it. Meredith felt something she had not expected to feel again. Hope. The radio crackled to life just after midnight, filling the warm cabin with a news broadcast that changed everything. Garrett had been monitoring weather updates while Meredith rested near the wood stove. Her contractions had stabilized into a manageable rhythm, giving her body time to recover from the hypothermia before the final push of labor began. The warmth had seeped back into her bones, and for the first time in hours, she felt like survival might actually be possible. She had been drifting towards sleep when the announcer's voice cut through the static. Breaking news from Cascade County. Local authorities are conducting an emergency search for Meredith Calloway, a 32-year-old pregnant woman who disappeared during tonight's historic blizzard. Her husband, Douglas Calloway, reported her missing approximately 2 hours ago after she allegedly wandered away from their vehicle during a mental health crisis. Meredith sat up so fast that the room spun around her. The blankets fell away from her shoulders as she stared at the radio with wide, horrified eyes. What did he say? Garrett held up a hand to silence her as the broadcast continued. According to her husband, Mrs. Calloway has been experiencing severe emotional instability throughout her pregnancy. Mr. Calloway stated that she became disoriented during the drive to the hospital and exited the vehicle before he could stop her. He describes her as confused and potentially dangerous to herself. The announcer paused briefly before continuing. In a press conference held moments ago, Mr. Calloway tearfully pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. He stated that his wife had been seeing a psychiatrist for prenatal depression and had stopped taking her medication without his knowledge. Search and rescue teams have been mobilized, but conditions remain extremely dangerous. Local authorities are urging residents to stay indoors and report any sightings immediately. Garrett switched off the radio. The sudden silence felt heavier than the blizzard howling outside the cabin walls. "He is lying," Meredith said, her voice shaking with fury and disbelief. "I have never seen a psychiatrist. I have never taken any medication. He drove me out there deliberately. He disabled the car. He walked away and left me to die. And now he is telling everyone that I am crazy." Garrett nodded slowly, his weathered face set in hard lines. He is covering his tracks, making himself the worried husband instead of the attempted murderer. If you had died out there, the story would have written itself. Tragic accident. Unstable pregnant woman wanders into blizzard during mental breakdown. Heartbroken husband tried to save her but arrived too late. Meredith felt physically sick. The level of planning involved was staggering. Douglas had not just tried to kill her. He had constructed an entire narrative to protect himself, complete with fabricated medical history and emotional testimony. He had probably planted fake evidence at their home, created false paper trails, paid off anyone who might contradict his story. "I have the phone," she said desperately. "I have all the messages between him and his mistress. The proof of what he planned is right there in black and white." Garrett picked up the phone from where it sat on the rough wooden table. The battery indicator showed 2% remaining, a fading red sliver of hope. "We need to get this to the authorities," he agreed. "But we need to be smart about it. Your husband has money and connections. If we go in unprepared, he could spin this against you. Make it look like you stole his phone and fabricated the messages yourself. Claim you are having the exact breakdown he described." "So what do we do?" Meredith asked. "How do we fight someone who has already written the story?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant as he calculated their options. "I have a satellite radio in the shed, emergency frequency. We can contact Sheriff Patterson directly. Bypass whatever official channels your husband has been working. Wade Patterson is a good man. Honest. He will not just accept your husband's version without investigation." Meredith felt a small spark of hope, but it was surrounded by darkness on all sides. Every hour that passed was another hour for Douglas to solidify his lies, another hour for him to poison public opinion, another hour for him to prepare legal defenses and bribe officials and eliminate anyone who might stand against him. "What if they do not believe me?" she asked quietly. "What if he has already convinced everyone that I am unstable?" Garrett met her gaze with steady, unyielding eyes. "Then we make them believe you. We document everything, the GPS coordinates where I found you, the condition of the car, the removed fuse, your physical state when I pulled you from that SUV, and we get that phone to a forensic expert who can verify those messages are authentic and unaltered." He paused, then added softly, "I have seen innocent people destroyed by liars before, Meredith. I have also seen those liars eventually face the truth. It might take time. It might take everything you have. But the truth is the one thing your husband cannot control forever." A contraction gripped Meredith's abdomen, forcing her to close her eyes and breathe through the pain. When it finally released her, She felt a new determination settling into her bones alongside the fear. "There is someone who might help," she said. "My friend Noel." Douglas had her number saved in that phone. He was monitoring our communications. Garrett handed her the phone. "Then call her. Now, before the battery dies completely." Meredith dialed Noel's number with trembling fingers and pressed the phone to her ear. Each ring felt like an eternity. She prayed that after all these years of distance, her friend would answer. She prayed that Douglas had not gotten to her first. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello, Mo." Noel's voice was confused and sleepy, thick with the fog of interrupted dreams. "Who is this, Noel?" "It is Meredith. Please do not hang up. I am alive. Douglas tried to kill me tonight, and I have proof of everything." The silence on the other end stretched for 3 heartbeats. "My God, Meredith. The news said you were missing. Where are you? Are you safe?" "I am safe for now. But Douglas is telling everyone I had a mental breakdown. None of it is true. He left me in the blizzard to die, and he has been planning this for months with his mistress. I have their messages." Noel's voice sharpened into the professional tone of a journalist who had just discovered a story. "Tell me everything," she said, "and do not leave anything out." Meredith spoke as fast as she could, racing against the dying battery. She told Noel about the drive into the mountains, the disabled car, the abandoned wedding ring, the secret phone. She told her about Vivian and the insurance policy and the planned escape to Costa Rica. The phone died mid-sentence, cutting her off before she could finish. But she had said enough. Noel was smart, resourceful, and fearless. If anyone could help expose Douglas for what he truly was, it was her. For the first time since Douglas had walked away from her in the blizzard, Meredith allowed herself to believe that she might actually win this fight. She had no idea how wrong she was. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, the storm finally exhausting itself into scattered flurries that drifted down from a gray sky. The world outside Garrett's cabin was transformed into a landscape of pure white, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Meredith had not slept. The contractions continued in steady waves, growing stronger as the hours passed. Garrett had delivered babies before during his time as a medic, and he assured her that she was progressing normally. But normal felt like a concept from another lifetime. The satellite radio crackled at just after 7 in the morning. Garrett had been trying to reach Sheriff Patterson since first light, and finally a voice responded through the static. "This is Sheriff Patterson." "Who am I speaking to, Wade?" "It is Garrett Bowen. I have Meredith Calloway with me at my cabin. She is 11 and she has one hell of a story to tell you." The line was quiet for a moment. "Garrett, every law enforcement officer in 3 counties is looking for that woman. Her husband says she is unstable and dangerous. Her husband is a liar and a would-be murderer." Garrett replied flatly. "He drove her into the mountains last night and left her to die. I found her barely conscious in a disabled vehicle with her water already broken. She has evidence on a phone, messages between her husband and his mistress, planning the whole thing." Another pause. "That is a serious accusation. It is a serious crime, Sheriff. And if you want to know the truth instead of the story her husband has been selling, you need to get up to my cabin as soon as the roads are clear." Sheriff Patterson agreed to come himself, along with 2 deputies. The roads would take several hours to become passable, but by midday he expected to reach the cabin. Meredith spent those hours preparing. She wrote down everything she could remember in chronological order. The strange behavior Douglas had shown in the weeks leading up to the storm, the route he had taken into the mountains, every detail of their final conversation before he walked away. Noel called back on Garrett's satellite phone just before noon. She had spent the entire night working, and her voice was hoarse with exhaustion and excitement. "Meredith, I found things. Bad things. Your husband is in serious financial trouble. Multiple gambling debts to some very dangerous people. His real estate company is hemorrhaging money. He took out that life insurance policy on you 6 months ago, and he increased the payout 3 times since then." Meredith closed her eyes. "How did I not see any of this? Because he did not want you to see it." Noel replied gently. "He was very good at hiding it. But I also found something else. His mistress, Vivian Hartley. She bought 2 plane tickets to Vancouver 3 weeks ago. One way. She paid cash. Can you prove all of this? I am working on it. But I need that phone. Meredith, the messages on that phone are the key to everything. Without them, it is your word against his. And he has been laying groundwork for months to make your word worthless. Sheriff Patterson will be here in a few hours. Meredith said, I will make sure he gets the phone into evidence. Good. And Meredith, I mean, be careful. A man who would leave his pregnant wife to die in a blizzard is not going to stop just because his first plan failed. He has too much to lose. The sheriff arrived at 2 in the afternoon with 2 deputies and a look of deep skepticism on his face. But as Meredith told her story, as she showed him the phone and walked him through the messages, that skepticism slowly transformed into barely contained fury. This is premeditated attempted murder, Patterson said when she finished, and conspiracy, and insurance fraud, and probably half a dozen other charges I will need a prosecutor to name. He took the phone carefully, sealing it in an evidence bag with gloved hands. I am going to need you to come into town and make a formal statement. He told Meredith, we will get this phone to our forensic team and verify every message. And then I am going to arrest Douglas Calloway and watch the smug look on his face disappear. Meredith felt tears welling in her eyes. You believe me, Patterson met her gaze steadily. Ma'am, I have been a sheriff for 22 years. I know what a liar looks like. And everything your husband has said since last night has the smell of a man trying to cover up something ugly. For the first time since the nightmare began, Meredith felt like she was not fighting alone. The drive into town was slow and careful over roads still covered in snow. Meredith sat in the back of the sheriff's SUV with Garrett beside her, his quiet presence a steady comfort. The contractions had intensified during the journey, and she knew she would need to get to a hospital soon. They reached the sheriff's station just as the sun was beginning to set. Patterson helped her inside and settled her in a comfortable chair before sending a deputy to escort her to the hospital once her statement was complete. Everything felt like it was falling into place. The evidence was in official hands. The sheriff was on her side. Noel was building a case that would expose Douglas for exactly what he was. Then Patterson's phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, and his face went completely white. What is it? Meredith asked. Patterson lowered the phone slowly. There has been a break-in at my deputy's home. The one who was transporting the evidence bags to the forensic lab. Meredith felt ice spreading through her veins. The phone is gone. Patterson said, someone stole it along with all the backup files. And my deputy is in the hospital with a concussion. He never saw who attacked him. The room seemed to tilt around Meredith as the words sank in. Douglas? Douglas had done this. He had stolen back the only evidence that could prove his guilt. And just like that, her false victory crumbled into dust. The next 72 hours delivered blow after blow until Meredith felt like she was drowning on dry land. Each time she thought she had found solid ground, the floor collapsed beneath her feet. The theft of the phone was only the first catastrophe. Sheriff Patterson launched an immediate investigation into the break-in, but the trail went cold within hours. Whoever had targeted his deputy had been utterly professional. No fingerprints on the windows or doors, no witnesses in the rural area where the deputy lived alone, no security footage from the single camera that had mysteriously failed to record that night. Douglas had hired someone very good at making evidence disappear. Then we traced the money, Patterson said grimly during his visit to her hospital room. Whoever he hired, he had to pay them somehow. But Meredith knew that tracing money through Douglas's labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts would take months. Months she did not have. The second catastrophe struck on the morning of the second day. Noelle called with a voice that trembled despite her obvious effort to sound strong. Meredith, someone broke into my apartment last night. My laptop is gone. All my backup drives. Every piece of research I gathered on Douglas and his finances. They even took the notebooks where I wrote my handwritten notes. Everything is gone. Meredith sat in the hospital bed where she had been admitted for observation, her hand pressed against the curve of her stomach. The baby was still holding on, but the doctors had warned her that stress was sending her blood pressure into dangerous territory. She needed to stay calm. Staying calm felt impossible. He is erasing everything, she whispered. Every trail, every piece of evidence, every path we could use to prove what he did. There is more, Noelle said reluctantly. I did not want to tell you this while you are in the hospital, but you need to know. Douglas filed a legal motion this morning through his attorney, Preston Clark. Meredith recognized the name. Preston Clark was known throughout Montana as the lawyer you hired when you were guilty and rich enough to afford the best defense money could buy. What kind of motion? She asked. Noelle took a deep breath. They are claiming that you are mentally unstable and pose an immediate danger to yourself and your unborn child. The motion requests emergency custody of the baby the moment you give birth. They want to take her from you before you even leave the delivery room. The words hit Meredith like physical blows. Custody. Douglas tried to murder me in a blizzard, and now he wants custody of our child. The motion includes sworn statements from 2 psychiatrists who claim they treated you during your pregnancy. They describe symptoms of severe prenatal psychosis, hallucinations, paranoid delusions, violent ideation. None of it is true, obviously, but Douglas has been preparing these lies for months. And the court believes this. Noel hesitated before answering. The court has scheduled an emergency hearing for next week. Without the phone, without my research, without any physical evidence of what Douglas did, it becomes your word against his. And he has spent a long time making sure his word sounds more credible than yours. Meredith felt something fracturing inside her chest. Not despair exactly, something worse. The cold realization that she had been completely outmaneuvered by a man she had trusted with everything she had. Then the third catastrophe arrived on the afternoon of the third day, walking through her hospital door in the form of Garrett Bowen. His head was wrapped in thick bandages. His left arm hung in a sling. His face was pale beneath his mountain tan, and he moved with the careful slowness of someone managing serious pain with every step. Meredith pushed herself upright in the bed. "What happened to you?" "2 men jumped me at my cabin last night," Garrett said quietly. "They were waiting inside when I got back from checking the road conditions. They wanted to know what else you told me. What other evidence we might have hidden. What plans we had made." He lowered himself into the chair beside her bed with a wince that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. "I did not tell them anything useful. But they worked me over pretty thoroughly before they believed me. 3 broken ribs, cracked collarbone, bruised kidney. The doctors said I was lucky they did not kill me." Meredith felt tears streaming down her face. "This is my fault. I brought this to you. I should never have let you get involved. You could have died because of me." Garrett shook his head firmly, his jaw set in that stubborn line she had come to recognize. "You did not do this to me, Meredith. Your husband did. And I have survived worse than a couple of hired thugs with bad attitudes. I spent 20 years patching up soldiers in combat zones. A beating from 2 cowards who attack old men in the dark does not scare me. I am not going anywhere. But what do we do now? The phone is gone. Noel's research is destroyed. You are injured. The court is about to take my baby away before I even get to hold her. Douglas has taken everything." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, snow was falling again, softer than the blizzard but steady. A white curtain being drawn slowly across the world. "Your husband thinks he has won," Garrett said finally. "He thinks he has destroyed everything that could hurt him. And when a man like that thinks he has won, he gets careless, arrogant, overconfident. I do not have time to wait for him to get overconfident. The hearing is in 6 days. If I walk into that courtroom without evidence, I will lose my daughter." "Then we do not wait," Garrett replied. "We accelerate his arrogance. We make him believe you have given up completely, that he has broken you. And then we give him a chance to gloat to someone he thinks is on his side. You want to trap him. I want to give him enough rope to hang himself." Garrett corrected. "A man who brags about what he has done when he thinks he is safe. A recording we can take straight to the court. Can it even work?" "It has to work," Garrett said. "Because if it does not, you lose everything. And I did not pull you out of that blizzard just to watch you be destroyed by the man who put you there." Meredith looked down at her stomach, at the daughter she had not yet met but already loved with everything in her. "Then let us start planning," she said quietly. "Tell me exactly what I need to do." The plan required Meredith to do the hardest thing imaginable. She had to pretend Douglas had won. She would contact him through Vivian, sounding broken and defeated. She would offer to sign away everything in exchange for him dropping the custody motion. The offer would appeal to his greed and his certainty that he was smarter than everyone around him. Douglas would not resist the chance to gloat. He never could. The call to Vivian happened on the 4th day after the blizzard. Meredith sat in her hospital bed with a recording app running silently on her phone. "Vivian, this is Meredith Calloway. Please do not hang up." "Why are you calling me?" Vivian's voice was cold and suspicious. "Because I know you won." Meredith forced her voice to crack. "You and Douglas. You won. I do not have the evidence anymore. I do not have witnesses. I just want this to be over. What exactly do you want? I want to make a deal. I will sign over my rights to the insurance policy. I will drop all claims against Douglas. I will disappear and never come back. All I want is for him to withdraw the custody motion and let me have my baby. Why should I believe you are not setting a trap because I am tired? Meredith let the tears come, and they were not entirely fake. I almost died in that blizzard, and all I could think about was my daughter. Not revenge, not justice, just her. I want to protect my baby. Nothing else matters anymore. Vivian was quiet for several seconds. I will talk to Douglas. If he agrees to meet, I will let you know where and when. The wait lasted 18 hours before Vivian called back. Douglas would meet Meredith at a cafe in downtown Helena, tomorrow at noon, public place, neutral territory. The night before the meeting, Meredith could not sleep. Contractions rolled through her body every 20 minutes, each one stronger than the last. Her daughter was running out of patience. Time was running out for everything. She whispered to her stomach in the darkness, I will protect you, no matter what happens tomorrow, no matter what it keys. Garrett drove her into Helena the next morning despite his injuries. He could not enter the cafe without Douglas recognizing him, but he positioned himself at a coffee shop across the street. If anything goes wrong, Garrett said firmly, you walk out immediately. Douglas was already waiting when she entered the cafe. He sat at a corner table with Vivian beside him and a folder of documents spread in front of him. Both of them looked up when Meredith approached. Douglas smiled that charming smile that had once made her feel safe. Meredith, he said warmly, I am so glad you finally came to your senses. She lowered herself into the chair across from him. Her recording device was hidden in her coat pocket where she had placed it that morning. I did not have a choice, she said quietly. You took everything from me. Douglas leaned back in his chair, visibly enjoying her apparent defeat. You know, I really did underestimate you. I thought the cold would finish you before anyone could possibly find you. But here you are, still causing problems. Vivian laughed beside him. She should have died in that blizzard. It would have been so much cleaner. Meredith forced her expression to stay neutral. Is that what you plan, to let the storm cover everything? Douglas shrugged with casual confidence. The storm was perfect. A natural disaster. No evidence, no witnesses, no complicated cleanup required. If that old hunter had not been out checking his traps in the middle of a blizzard, you would be another tragic story on the evening news right now. He picked up the folder and slid it across the table. But since you insist on breathing, we do this the hard way. Sign these papers, and I will withdraw the custody motion. You disappear quietly. We pretend none of this ever happened. Meredith looked at the documents without touching them. You really thought you could kill me, your wife, the mother of your child. Douglas leaned forward, dropping his voice to a whisper thick with contempt. I did not just think it. Meredith, I planned it. Every single detail. The route to the mountain, the disabled car, the fake psychiatric records, the tearful press conference. All of it was calculated. You were supposed to do. And I was supposed to collect $5 million in insurance money and fly to Costa Rica with Vivian by the end of the week. He sat back again, spreading his hands. The only variable I could not control was some random old man playing wilderness hero. But here we are. You sign those papers. Everybody gets to walk away with something. You get your baby. I get my freedom. Everybody wins. Meredith reached for the folder slowly. Then she stopped. There is one problem with your plan. Douglas, what is that? I survived, and you just confessed everything. The color drained from Douglas's face as Sheriff Patterson stepped through the back door of the cafe with two deputies directly behind him. Douglas Calloway, Patterson said clearly, you are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Vivian screamed and lunged toward the front door, but a deputy intercepted her before she made it 3 steps. Douglas remained frozen in his chair, staring at Meredith with an expression of pure disbelief that almost made all of it worth the pain. You should have made sure I was dead, Meredith said quietly. That was your mistake. The deputies moved in to handcuff him, and Meredith watched without looking away. She wanted him to see her face. She wanted him to know that the woman he had tried to erase was the one who had destroyed him. The trial began 6 weeks later in the Cascade County Courthouse. By then, the whole country knew the story. A pregnant woman abandoned in a blizzard by her own husband, a rescue by a stranger, a fight for survival that had captivated millions. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse on the first day of proceedings. Reporters from every major network jostled for position on the steps. Social media had turned Meredith into something between a hero and a symbol, though she felt like neither. She was just a woman trying to protect her daughter. Charlotte Grace had been born 3 weeks after Douglas's arrest. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with her mother's dark hair and blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unusual intensity. Meredith had held her in the delivery room and wept with a mixture of joy and grief and overwhelming relief. Garrett had been there, standing guard outside her door like a sentinel. He had refused to leave her side since the cafe, despite his healing injuries. When she had asked him why, he had simply said that some things were worth protecting. Now she sat in the front row of the courtroom with Charlotte sleeping in a carrier beside her. Noelle sat on her other side, notebook ready, prepared to document every moment of the proceedings for the article she was writing. Douglas was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He looked smaller than Meredith remembered. The arrogance that had defined him seemed to have leaked away during his weeks in custody, leaving behind something hollow and diminished. His attorney, Preston Clark, had mounted an aggressive defense. He argued that the recording from the cafe had been obtained illegally. He claimed that Douglas's confession had been coerced, that Meredith had entrapped him. He presented character witnesses who testified to Douglas's good reputation in the business community. None of it worked. The prosecution, led by a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Foster, was relentless. She presented phone records showing Douglas's communications with Vivian in the months before the blizzard. She produced financial documents proving the gambling debts and insurance fraud. She played the recording from the cafe 3 times, letting Douglas's own words condemn him. Then she called Meredith to the stand. Walking to the witness chair felt like walking through water. Everything moved slowly. Every sound seemed muffled. Meredith settled into the seat and looked out at the packed courtroom, her heart pounding against her ribs. Foster approached with gentle professionalism. "Mrs. Calloway, can you describe what had happened on the night of January 15th? Meredith told the story from the beginning. The drive into the mountains, the abandoned car, the wedding ring left on the dashboard, the cold seeping into her bones as she realized her husband was not coming back. The phone with the messages that revealed everything. Her voice remained steady throughout, even when describing the worst moments. She had practiced this. She had prepared herself to speak the truth without breaking down. When she finished, Foster turned toward the jury. This woman was left to burn by the man who had vowed to love and protect her. Left in a blizzard, in labor, with no heat, no help, and no hope. Her only crime was trusting someone who saw her as nothing more than an insurance policy with a pulse. Preston Clark cross-examined her aggressively, trying to suggest that she had fabricated the entire story. But Meredith did not waver. Every question he threw at her, she answered with calm certainty. Then it was Douglas's turn. His decision to take the stand was a mistake that even his expensive attorney could not prevent. Douglas still believed he could charm his way out of anything. He still believed that if he could just explain his side, everyone would understand. Foster dismantled him in less than an hour. She walked him through his own words from the recording. She forced him to explain the gambling debts he had hidden from his wife. She made him account for every dollar he had transferred to offshore accounts in the weeks before the blizzard. And then she asked the question that ended him. "Mr. Calloway, when you walked away from that car and left your pregnant wife in a deadly blizzard, what did you think was going to happen to her?" Douglas's composure finally cracked. His face reddened, his hands clenched on the witness stand railing. "She was supposed to die," he shouted. "She was supposed to freeze to death and then nobody was ever supposed to know. But she would not stop. She would not just give up and let it happen." The courtroom erupted. The judge pounded his gavel. Preston Clark buried his face in his hands. Douglas seemed to realize what he had done a moment too late. The color drained from his face as he looked toward the jury and saw 12 expressions of undisguised horror. The closing arguments took less than 2 hours. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes before returning, guilty on all counts. Douglas collapsed into his chair when the verdict was read. Vivian, who had already pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony, watched from a holding room where she would learn her own fate. The judge sentenced Douglas to 45 years in federal prison. Vivian received 15 years, plus mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Meredith sat in the front row as the sentences were handed down. Charlotte stirred in her carrier, and Meredith reached down to touch her daughter's tiny hand. It was over. Douglas was led away in chains, and Meredith watched him go without feeling the satisfaction she had expected. There was no triumph in this moment, only exhaustion and a quiet sense of closure. Garrett appeared beside her as the courtroom emptied. "How do you feel?" Meredith considered the question carefully. "Like I survived something that should have killed me," she said finally. "And now I need to figure out how to live." 6 months had passed since the trial ended. The snow that had nearly killed Meredith had long since melted, replaced by wildflowers that painted the Montana hillsides in brilliant swaths of purple and yellow and orange. The mountains that had once felt like prison walls now stood as silent guardians against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Meredith stood on the porch of her new home, a modest cabin that sat on 10 acres of land adjacent to Garrett's property. She had bought it with the settlement money from Douglas's seized assets, choosing simplicity over the luxury she had once thought she wanted. Charlotte rested against her hip, 6 months old now and growing more curious about the world with each passing day. Her blue eyes tracked the flight of a butterfly across the yard with intense concentration. "You like that, little one," the butterfly. Charlotte made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been commentary on something only babies could perceive. The screen door creaked behind her, and Garrett stepped onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. He moved more easily now, his injuries fully healed, though he still favored his left side when he thought no one was watching. "Mail came," he said, handing her one of the cups. Noelle's article made the cover. Meredith took the magazine he offered. The cover featured a photograph of her standing outside the courthouse after the verdict, Charlotte in her arms, her face showing exhaustion and relief in equal measure. The headline read, "The Woman Who Refused to Disappear." She set it aside without opening it. "I never wanted to be famous for this." Garrett nodded slowly. "Fame is not the same as purpose. What matters is what you do with the attention." He was right. In the months since the trial, Meredith had channeled the public interest in her story into something meaningful. She had started a foundation for survivors of domestic violence, focusing specifically on women whose abusers used legal and financial manipulation as weapons. The donations had already allowed her to help dozens of women escape situations that had once seemed inescapable. Noelle had left journalism to run the foundation's communications. She had found something in the work that reporting had never given her, a sense of making a direct difference rather than just documenting problems from the outside. "There is something else in the mail," Garrett said carefully. Meredith looked at the envelope he was holding. No return address. Her name written in handwriting she recognized immediately. Douglas. She took the envelope and turned it over in her hands. Part of her wanted to burn it without reading whatever was inside, but another part, the part that had survived a blizzard and a trial and the complete destruction of everything she thought her life would be, needed to see what he had to say. She opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The letter was brief. Douglas wrote that he had made mistakes, that he thought about her and Charlotte every day, that he understood now how wrong he had been, that he still loved her and hoped someday she could find it in her heart to forgive him. He asked her to visit him in prison. Meredith read the words twice. Then she walked inside to the fireplace, struck a match, and held the flame to the corner of the paper. She watched it burn until there was nothing left but ash. Garrett stood in the doorway, watching without comment. "He thinks he can manipulate me even now," Meredith said quietly. "From a prison cell 1,500 miles away. He still thinks he can control how I feel." "Can he?" She looked at the ash in the fireplace, then at Charlotte, who was reaching toward the dancing shadows the afternoon light cast across the floor. "No. He lost that power the moment I decided I was going to survive." That night, Meredith sat on the porch after Charlotte had fallen asleep. The Montana sky blazed with more stars than she had ever seen in her life in the city. The air smelled like pine and wildflowers and the particular sweetness that came after summer rain. Garrett joined her after a while, settling into the chair beside hers with the comfortable silence of old friendship. "I never thanked you properly," Meredith said. "For everything. You did not have to help me. You did not know me at all." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "My wife died 7 years ago," he said finally. "Cancer. Took her slow, which was worse than fast in some ways." gave us time to say goodbye, but also time to watch her disappear piece by piece. Meredith waited, sensing there was more. When I found you as that car, he continued, I saw someone who was not ready to disappear. Someone who was fighting to stay even when everything was trying to erase her. I could not save my wife, but I could save you. And maybe that does not make up for what I lost, but it makes waking up in the morning feel like it has a point. Meredith reached across the space between them and took his weathered hand. Thank you, she said simply. He squeezed her fingers gently and said nothing else. Sometimes silence was the truest answer. Later, before she went to bed, Meredith stood in Charlotte's doorway and watched her daughter sleep. The mobile above the crib turned slowly, casting star-shaped shadows across the walls. The baby's chest rose and fell in the easy rhythm of dreams that held no memory of blizzards or betrayal. You will never know what it feels like to be abandoned. Meredith whispered, I promise you that. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago. Naive, trusting. So desperate for love that she had ignored every warning sign her husband had displayed. That woman felt like a stranger now. Someone she had left behind in a frozen car on a mountain road. The woman she had become was different. Harder in some ways, softer in others, capable of a fierce love that frightened her sometimes with its intensity. Douglas had tried to erase her. The blizzard had tried to kill her. The legal system had tried to silence her. She had survived all of it. Meredith closed Charlotte's door gently and walked to her own bedroom. Through the window, she could see the mountains rising black against the star-filled sky. The same mountains that had almost been her grave now felt like home. She climbed into bed and closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without dreaming of snow.